They told me I was trespassing on my own driveway, and the officer said it like it was a routine call, like he'd pulled over someone for a broken taillight. Not that he'd walked up to a man standing on the land his family had owned for generations and read him a complaint. That's where this starts. Sheriff Wade Collins, a cruiser, the crunch of gravel under boots, and Heather Mallory standing behind him with a stack of papers and a smirk that could sour milk. Stick with me because one small, stupid-sounding accusation turned into a paper war that nearly stripped a community of its dignity and left one woman wishing she'd never learned how to print a map. I'd lived on this ridge 21 years, born in the dirt kind of ownership, the kind where your granddad carved property lines with a plow and a promise. So when Wade said the HOA filed a trespass report, I laughed on the inside and raised a hand to the dirt under my boots on the outside. Heather stepped forward, voice polished, accusations ready. My solar array was an eyesore. My cattle gate violated the approved materials list. My workshop didn't meet their standards. It was the same litany she used on half the neighborhood, a handbook of petty cruelties dressed up as governance. But something about her confidence felt wrong. Too sure. Too neat. Bullies are loud when they know they can make noise, and they're only that loud when the noise follows paperwork. I told Wade there was a deed that this ranch predated Mallory Ridge by decades, and he did what good officers do. He wrote a report and asked me to show proof if I had it. Heather left with her heels clicking off my gravel like punctuation. The very next day, an envelope with the HOA seal sat in my mailbox. 3 violation notices, inside each more absurd than the last unauthorized structure modification, noise disturbance from machinery, unregistered guests occupying driveway space. They'd weaponized everything ordinary about my life, my tractor, my nephew's truck, the solar panels I put up to keep lights on through winter storms. Then came an email blast to the neighborhood painting me as a danger to property values. By sundown, neighbors who'd waved for years were averting their eyes. Miguel Ortega, who owned the farmhouse 2 deliveries down, came by later and said what everyone whispered. Heather comes after people until they break. The Turners. The Bowdens gone packed, sold gone because they didn't fight. Miguel's warning lodged in my ribs. She comes hard when she thinks she's backed by something official. So I went looking for the official thing. She had the paperwork she was hiding behind. County admin is the kind of place where people don't waste breath on nonsense. And Linda Barrett behind the counter had the face of someone who'd seen every scheme and found most of them laughable. She pulled my parcel up and frowned. Annotations added during the developer transition in 2001, easement overlays, boundaries redrawn for planning maps. But she said those planning adjustments weren't recorded as legal transfers. They were just working documents. They were the kind of map a developer circulates to build a vision, not a deed anybody signs in perpetuity. Then she slid a scanned planning map toward me, and I felt my stomach drop. On that faded print, parcels that matched my pasture were colored like HOA common area. To anyone who never checked the recorded deed, the planning map looked authoritative. And if you wave that thing around at enough meetings, you can convince a village to accept fiction as fact. Heather had been living in that fiction. Linda's shrug turned into something else when she leaned close. If you challenge this, she said, they'll be forced to defend 20 years of unauthorized land use. That's a mess most HOAs can't afford. For the first time, I saw leverage in a target. If I could make the fake map and the real deed sit side by side, the whole thing would start to unravel. I called Tommy Reed County Surveyor, the guy who used to run lines with my father and knew these ridges like fingerprints. Tommy showed up with GPS gear and a dry grin. You want the truth in orange, he said, and we threaded flags across the ground. Orange stakes hammered like accusations into the soil where the playground, the pavilion, the mailbox cluster, even the main corridor should have been. People started to notice. That's when Heather stepped out onto her porch, and the smirk slipped. She lunged at the flags like they were personal insults. Bingo, I thought, the glare of someone who's been comfortable too long. Tommy kept hammering stakes, methodical and calm, while residents poured onto sidewalks to see what the fuss was about. Janice Fuller from the Pavilion Committee, usually one of Heather's staunch explorers of rulebooks, stood speechless. The silence around Heather thickened like a winter coat. Once the flags went in, the neighborhood shifted. People who'd nodded along at board meetings started asking questions. Is this really his land, they asked each other. It's a funny thing, when you point out a truth in bright plastic, it's hard to pretend it's not there. Heather's posture changed from command to clutch. Flags don't just mark land, they mark liability. And suddenly everyone could see what she had been calling community was actually someone else's property being used without permission. She didn't go quietly. Night cameras went on barn roof, oak tree, my driveway, because people who lose power don't stop at words. A few nights later, the footage came in, and I watched a woman in a windbreaker dump yard waste onto my land. Then later, her husband's trailer gouged ruts in the pasture. And on night 7, Heather crouched in the dark with a can of green spray paint repainting Tommy's orange flags to match the grass, trying to erase the truth. The grain in that video would hold up in court. I'd caught her in trespass, tampering with legal markers, and the camera framed her face like the final piece of evidence. Next move, build a case. I printed time-stamped, logged, and labeled until the binder on my kitchen table looked like a small legal library. Then I called Grace Holloway, an attorney with a voice like steel and a schedule that suggested she liked winning more than she liked coffee. She read the binder like someone hungry. The easement that allowed developers to use my land for staging expired in 2017. Never renewed, never extended. The HOA had been operating facilities without permission for 6 years. Every violation they sent me was invalid if their jurisdiction didn't include my parcels. Grace's smile when she said the word fraud was not the warm kind. The HOA had been enforcing rules on land they didn't own, demanding fines, threatening enforcement that crosses a line you can't just paper over. We sent a cease and desist, notified the county documented survey tampering, and most importantly, we kept the evidence neat. Clean records make loud avalanches. Messy grudges make bad court exhibits. Heather panicked in ways big bullies don't expect. She escalated with more notices, taped fines to my gate like confetti of desperation. But momentum had a new owner truth. Miguel produced stacks of old HOA letters, petty fines, vindictive complaints, years of intimidation, and Janice brought meeting recordings. Neighbors who once bowed started bringing their binders. Grace did the math out loud, maintenance penalties, back rent estimates, the cost of removing everything built on my parcels numbers that make even people who like confrontation go quiet. $1.2 million was the low estimate to strip the illegally built structures. We went public, not with shouting but with a barbecue neighbors, county officials, a sheriff who wanted to watch the scene but wasn't going to play favorites. Heather rolled in with an SUV and a deputy in tow, expecting to stop whatever I'd planned. I stood on a plywood platform and laid it out, original deed planning maps, survey results, the footage of her painting flags. The hush after that reveal felt like someone cut the strings on a puppet show. When someone in the crowd whispered she did, that it didn't sound like accusation, it sounded like disillusionment. People had been looking at a leader who'd turned petty governance into a kind of emotional warfare. Grace laid out the legal reality. The HOA's authority depends on easements or ownership, and theirs had been expired. Sheriff Collins, who'd come to warn me and stayed to see it through, nodded and said the evidence would go to the county attorney. Heather's calls to the station became the sound of someone trying to hold on to a story that wasn't true. What happened next was procedural and perfect. Resignations came in like dominoes. Internal emails, private posts, some frankly ugly comments. All of it made public, stripped the last layer of sheen off a woman who'd made fear into a currency. The county opened an investigation, enforcement powers were limited, and Heather left with a letter, not a flourish. The HOA that had built its power on a planning map that was never recorded had to face the real-world deed statutes and neighbors who finally felt seen. The aftermath wasn't fireworks. It was the quieter justice that matters, a board willing to negotiate a lease that acknowledged my ownership while securing community access in a fair, transparent way and money repurposed for good. I signed an agreement, 10-year renewable lease, responsible maintenance by the HOA oversight clauses that prevent arbitrary enforcement. And I took the first lease payments and started the Maddox Trade Scholarship, $5,000 a year, for a local kid headed into electrical, plumbing, carpentry, agriculture. Because if you're going to take money from an HOA that once abused people, you might as well put it into building futures. So what's the takeaway? Maybe it's simple, the law matters, and so does the willingness to use it. But it's also that power, when left unchecked, becomes an addiction to control. And sometimes the antidote isn't violence or revenge, it's patience, documentation, and a few people who finally decide to look at the map for themselves. Justice in this case was a slow, steady pressure that revealed rotten foundations, and when they collapsed, the whole place got a chance to rebuild on honesty. I'll tell you this, standing at my fence, the sunset cutting the ridge into a black silhouette, the cattle gate creaking in the wind, like a long exhale, felt like more than winning. It felt like setting a house right that had been leaning for too long. If you've ever stood up against something that felt unfair, whether it was a boss, a neighbor, a rule that made no sense, drop a yes in the comments so folks know they're not alone out here. And here's the real question to argue about: when an entire community has been led by fear, is stripping power via public exposure the fairest way to fix things? Or does it risk replacing one kind of control with another? Tell me what you think. And if you've got a story where the little guy won with grit and the rule book on his side, share it. I want to hear it.
Cảm ơn các bạn đã xem video. Cảm ơn các bạn đã xem video.